lesson begins. The Galactic Academy of Sciences was the pride of the civilized galaxy, a towering structure of glass and crystal that floated above the capital world in orbit. Its lecture halls were vast domes filled with light and filled with students from every corner of the stars. It was here that the brightest young minds came to learn the deepest truths about life and survival, and it was here that a lesson unlike any other was about to begin. Inside one of the main lecture halls, the air shimmered with curiosity. Thousands of students from dozens of species filled the seats. Their eyes glittered in colors from green to silver to blazing orange. Their bodies were wrapped in robes or armored hides or scaled cloaks. Some clicked, their mandibles nervously, while others wrapped tails around their seats. It was a day that promised excitement, because the lecture today was about Deathworlds, the most dangerous class of planets known to the galaxy. Deathworlds were infamous in the galactic records. Whole expeditions had vanished in their jungles. Ships had been torn apart by storms that raged without warning. Creatures larger than tanks prowled the forests and seas. Poisonous air melted the lungs of those who breathed it wrongly, and diseases spread like wildfire. These were planets marked in red in every navigation system, and students came to study them like one might study nightmares. The professor was a long-limbed scholar from the Arctel species. His thin frame was wrapped in flowing dark robes, and his eyes glowed faintly as he adjusted the holo display behind him. He raised his voice, and the crowd fell silent. "Younglings," he said, "today we speak of worlds where nature itself conspires to erase life, where gravity crushes bones, where storms destroy continents, and where even water may kill you. These are what we call death worlds." The holo screen flared to life. A swirling green and blue planet appeared. It looked peaceful from orbit, a marble wrapped in clouds, but the professor's tone darkened as he continued. "This is Earth, catalogued as a Class 5 death world. Few who approach survive long enough to return, and those who do speak of horrors unending. Its oceans are filled with predators, its skies with storms, its lands with beasts capable of killing in an instant." The aliens in the room leaned forward. Some gasped, others whispered to each other in disbelief. Could such a place exist? The professor nodded gravely. Earth is unlike most habitable worlds. Its gravity is heavier than most species can endure. Its weather shifts in moments, from calm skies to raging hurricanes. Earthquakes tear the ground open, and volcanoes spew death into the air, as if the planet itself were alive and angry. One young Sarathi with glittering scales raised her clawed hand and asked, "How could life ever take root in such a nightmare?" The professor spread his hands and said, "Life adapts, but on Deathworlds it adapts in terrible ways. Plants poison to survive. Animals evolve teeth, claws, venom, and cunning to hunt. Entire ecosystems become arenas of endless war. Only the strongest endure, and even they do not last long." The words sank deep into the hearts of the students. Around the hall they shivered, imagining themselves on such a world. A planet where a moment of weakness meant certain death, where every shadow could hide a killer, where even the air might betray them. Near the very front of the hall sat a student who had not spoken a word. He looked unremarkable. Compared to the others, his body lacked scales or armored hides. His skin was smooth and pale. His frame seemed fragile compared to the towering insectoid or reptilian beings around him. Yet his eyes were steady and calm as he listened to the professor speak about Earth. He knew every detail was true, but he also knew that the story was not finished. As the professor continued to list the lethal qualities of Earth, describing venomous snakes, roaring storms, and savage predators, the human cadets' mind drifted back to his own childhood. He remembered the sound of thunder rattling the windows, the sight of wolves in the distance of the forest, the sting of illness that his body had fought off with time and medicine. To him, these things were not myths or horrors, they were life. They were memories of home. The class, however, could not imagine survival there. They whispered among themselves. One muttered that surely no intelligent life could rise from such chaos. Another said that if any had once existed, it must have perished long ago. The professor did not disagree. He spoke solemnly. It is unlikely that any civilization could come from such a planet. The conditions are too hostile for growth, too brutal for culture to take root. Human cadet sat still, his jaw tightening as the professor's words echoed. He wanted to speak, to say something to correct them, but he remained silent. For now, it was not his time to reveal the truth. He simply sat in the front row, listening as an entire galaxy dismissed his home as unlivable. The lesson had only begun and already tension hummed in the air. The aliens thought they were learning about a nightmare world. They had no idea that a native of that very nightmare was sitting only meters away from their teacher. They had no idea that everything they thought impossible was staring them in the face, waiting for the right moment to rise and speak. The catalog of nightmares. The great hall grew darker as the professor adjusted the holo display. The glowing planet of Earth now rotated slowly in the air above the crowd. Students leaned forward, their bodies tense, their minds filled with both fascination and dread. The professor's voice carried across the chamber with a heavy weight, as if the subject itself demanded fear. "Observe carefully," he said, and the images changed to scenes pulled from records. A vast ocean appeared, waves rising as high as towers before crashing down in thunderous fury. The professor explained that these storms, called hurricanes, could last for days, tearing entire cities to the ground with winds strong enough to rip the wings from a starship shuttle. The class gasped. Some covered their eyes, unable to watch the devastation. The image shifted to mountains, their peaks sharp and white with snow. Avalanches roared down the slopes at terrifying speeds, burying valleys and forests under walls of ice. The professor told them that the temperature there could drop so low that exposed flesh froze. In moments, entire regions of Earth could not sustain life yet. Still, creatures lived and hunted there. The alien students shivered at the thought of breathing air that could kill them simply by being too cold. Next came the forests, thick tangled, growths filled with endless green trees stretching into the skies, vines curling like traps, and beneath the canopy eyes glowed in the darkness. The professor's voice dropped as he described the predators: wolves with sharp fangs and coordinated hunting packs, bears that could crush bone with a single strike, serpents that swallowed prey whole, venomous spiders and insects so small they could slip into armor gaps but lethal enough to kill with a bite. The sound of claws scraping against bark echoed from the hollow simulation, and many students twitched in their seats. But that was not the worst of it. The hollow shifted again, this time to invisible enemies. The professor spoke of diseases, viruses, and bacteria, too small to see with the naked eye, yet capable of destroying entire populations. He explained that Earth's surface was thick with such invisible killers that its very soil and water teemed with organisms waiting to invade a body and consume it from within. A chorus of horrified whispers filled the room as students realized that even a single breath of Earth's air could mean death to them. Through it all, the human cadet in the front row remained silent. His face calm, his eyes steady, but deep inside a storm of memories swirled. He remembered the sharp sting of fevers as a child when his parents gave him medicine and told him he would grow stronger after surviving it. He remembered the wild forests where he and his friends had played climbing trees, running through fields, always aware of the danger but never backing down. These were not stories of horror to him, but stories of living, of enduring, of finding strength in a world that never offered mercy. The professor paused and let the hall settle before continuing. He raised his hand, and the hollow projected scenes of disasters, volcanoes spewing molten fire, rivers of red lava carving through land and swallowing everything in their path, earthquakes tearing open the ground, entire cities shaking apart. In seconds, lightning storms striking the land with bolts of pure energy capable of turning sand to glass, and thunder loud enough to shatter stone. The professor's words echoed over the fear of the crowd. This is not simply a planet with predators. This is a planet that itself fights against life. A student with shimmering wings raised her hand, her voice trembling. "Professor, why would any ship dare to land there? Why risk contact with such a place?" The professor's eyes burned with solemn truth. Because knowledge demands sacrifice. Some expeditions attempt to study the extremes of nature, but most who land never return. The survivors speak of an endless struggle for breath and food. They describe Earth as a prison of storms and monsters, a living hell from which escape is a blessing. The alien students recoiled. Some whispered curses, others made protective gestures in their native traditions. They could not comprehend how life could exist there, let alone rise to thought and reason. Yet at the very front row, the human cadet thought of the professor's words and almost smiled. He knew the storms, the predators, the earthquakes, and the sickness. He knew them not as myths but as parts of home. They were not curses, they were challenges, and challenges could be met. Still, he remained quiet for now. The class was too lost in fear to hear the truth. They saw Earth as a nightmare, carved from chaos and death. They did not yet see what it truly was, a crucible that forged strength, resilience, and cunning in those who called it home. That truth would come later, and when it did, it would shatter everything they believed about survival and power in the galaxy. For the moment the professor let the hollow fade and turned back to his audience, he could feel their fear and he welcomed it. He wanted them to understand the scale of danger that Deathworlds represented. He wanted them to remember that nature itself could be a greater enemy than any army. And he never once realized that a child of that very planet was seated only a few steps away, waiting, listening, and preparing to speak when the time was right. Alien. Questions and human silence. The lecture hall buzzed with whispers as the images faded from the hollow display. Students of every species turned to one another, their voices low but heavy with fear and disbelief. They spoke in their own languages. Wings fluttered, mandibles clattered, tails thumped against the floor. One thing was clear in all their tones: they could not imagine how any intelligent being could ever come from such a place. The professor stood calmly, allowing the tide of questions to swell until it threatened to overwhelm the hall. He raised one slender hand and silence fell, though it was uneasy. Silence filled with tension. The first question came from a tall student of the Moric species, his body covered in plates of hard chitin. He rose to his feet, his deep voice carrying through the chamber, "Professor, forgive my boldness, but if Earth is as you describe, then how does any expedition survive long enough to bring these records?" He tilted his head, his antennae twitching in confusion. Surely no fragile creature could endure such forces. The professor nodded gravely, confirming the suspicion. "Few expeditions do survive," he said, "and those that return are never the same. They speak of constant vigilance, of days spent fighting against hunger, and nights spent warding off predators. They speak of a world that rejects them at every step." Another voice rose, this time from a Sarathi, her emerald scales glittering as she leaned forward. "Professor, I cannot understand. If life there adapts only through venom claws and endless struggle, then would not the very idea of building homes or societies be impossible? A creature cannot build if it must fight every second to live." The professor spread his arms as though to say the answer was obvious. "Precisely," he replied. "That is why no records show signs of advanced civilization on such a planet. Deathworlds breed survivors, yes, but survivors do not have time for art, culture, or thought. They survive one moment to the next, until the planet claims them." The words sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others looked uneasy as though the thought itself was too grim to bear. A small winged student whispered to her friend, "Perhaps there were once people there, but the storms killed them all. Perhaps it is only ghosts now." The friend nodded quickly, eager to believe in extinction rather than the alternative. In the very front row, the human cadet sat quietly, his hands folded together. His face betrayed no reaction, but inside his chest his heart tightened. Each word from the professor struck him, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. The descriptions of danger were true. He had seen the storms, felt the weight of gravity, battled the illnesses and predators. But the claim that no society could grow there, that nothing intelligent could endure beyond survival, filled him with a sharp urge to rise and shout the truth. Yet he stayed silent, his jaw tight. He was not ready to reveal himself, not yet. The questions did not stop. A towering aquatic student whose body shimmered with shifting patterns of light raised a fin. "Professor, if no society can live there, then perhaps the only reason expeditions fail is because the planet itself resents intrusion. Could it be that such a world is cursed by the stars? The professor shook his head slowly. There is no curse, only natural cruelty. Earth is not alone in this. There are other death worlds, each marked with warnings, but Earth stands apart. It is the most hostile, known world that still supports complex life. That alone makes it both fascinating and terrifying. Gasps echoed again. Students whispered of the madness of ever going near such a place. Some suggested sealing it forever on charts. Others whispered of turning it into a forbidden system never to be touched again. The human cadet listened to them all, his mind steady but his spirit restless. He thought of his parents, of cities filled with light and music, of children running through streets and elders telling stories by fire. He thought of the warmth of family and the strength of community, forged not in safety, but in the very jaws of danger. He wanted to tell them that culture was not erased by struggle, but born from it. That art was not destroyed by storms, but inspired by them. That humanity had risen not in spite of Earth's trials, but because of them. Yet still he remained silent. His time had not come. The professor looked across the sea of fearful faces and believed his lesson had taken root. He thought his students now understood the truth of death worlds, that they would leave this hall wiser and more cautious. None of them could see that the greatest truth sat before them, a truth that breathed among them disguised in plain sight. The human cadet was a storm waiting for the right moment to break, and when it came, the galaxy's understanding of survival would never be the same. The slip of truth. The professor believed he had reached the heart of his lessons. Alien students sat wide-eyed and silent, their earlier whispers drowned in the weight of his words. The floating image of Earth still hovered above them, a jewel wrapped in storms and fire. The professor's thin voice rose again, sharp and final. The records prove beyond doubt, he said, that no intelligent civilization could emerge from such a crucible. To claim otherwise would be to deny reason itself. For a moment, no one dared to speak. Then a student near the back, a young Avrian with feathers, glistening in shades of violet, slowly raised her wing. She hesitated, her voice trembling. "Professor, forgive me. But what if one of these so-called natives appeared in this very hall? How would we know them? How would we believe them?" The question drew a ripple of laughter, nervous and uneasy, but laughter all the same. The thought seemed absurd to most impossible. The professor himself chuckled, shaking his elongated head. "A native of Earth standing here," he said. "That is fantasy. Such a being would not survive to reach us. They would perish long before stepping foot into this hall." The laughter spread, but not all found humor in it. Some sat quietly, considering the idea more deeply. A native in the front row, unnoticed, invisible, listening to every word. Some shivered at the thought, dismissing it quickly. But one or two eyes glanced about the crowd just in case. The human cadet felt the air grow heavier. His hands gripped the edge of his seat as the question echoed within him. What if one of these natives were here? He knew the answer. He was here. He had listened to his homeworld spoken of as nightmare, as myth, as a place unworthy of life. The time he had waited for had arrived. He could no longer stay silent. His breath slowed, his heart beat steady though fire burned in his chest. He raised his hand slowly, every motion deliberate. A hush fell as the professor noticed and tilted his head in recognition. "Yes, young one," he said. "What question troubles you?" The cadet rose to his feet. His uniform was plain, no decoration, no armor. His body looked soft compared to the scaled and armored forms around him. Yet as he stood, there was a quiet strength in his posture. His eyes met the professor's, unflinching and calm. He did not speak at once, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment sink into the hall. Then in a voice that carried far, though it was not loud, he said, "Perhaps the reason you believe no one could survive is because you have never asked one who has lived there." The word struck like lightning across the room. Gasps filled the air, tails lashed, mandibles clicked, wings rustled in shock. The professor froze his eyes, narrowing in disbelief. "What are you implying, student?" He asked, his tone sharper than before. The cadet stood firm. I am implying that you speak of Earth as if it were a tomb, but it is my home. I was born there, I lived there, I endured its storms and its beasts, and I stand here before you. The hall erupted. Chaos broke across the rows of students. Some shouted that it was a lie. Others hissed in fear, pulling back as if the human carried poison. Some stared wide-eyed, unable to comprehend what they heard. The professor himself staggered a step, his composure cracking. His voice rose, but it lacked the confidence it carried before impossible. He cried, "No creature of Earth could reach us." The cadet's calm answer cut through the noise. "Yet here I am." Silence followed, a silence thicker than the air of any storm. The professor stared at the cadet as if seeing him for the first time. The fragile frame, the smooth skin, the steady eyes, they had been in the hall from the beginning, and none had realized what he was. The class now saw not weakness but the unshakable truth that he had survived where none of them could. The professor's mouth opened, but no words came. His students no longer looked at him. They looked at the human standing in the front row, breathing, living, undeniable. The lesson he had planned was shattered. The truth was no longer his to give. It belonged to the cadet who had revealed himself with simple, quiet words. The moment lingered heavy and trembling. Every alien in that hall knew that. Everything they had been taught about survival strength and civilization had changed. They had seen the impossible, and it had raised its hand. The human speaks. The hall remained frozen after the cadet's revelation. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The professor's lips trembled, though no words came, and the alien students sat like statues, their eyes wide, their bodies tense. Some leaned back as if distance could protect them, while others leaned forward, caught between fear and wonder. The cadet's presence was a storm in their midst, and all waited for the thunder to follow. The human took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had carried this silence for too long, listening to his world described as nightmare and grave, and now the truth demanded a voice. He spoke slowly, each word careful and clear. "I was born on Earth, I grew under its skies, and I walked its forests. I endured its storms, its sickness, and its predators. Earth is not a tomb, it is alive, it is harsh. Yes, but it is also beautiful. It is not the end of life, it is the forge of it." The crowd shivered at the sound of his voice. The words carried no arrogance, only calm conviction that made them heavier than any boast. He lifted his gaze to the towering, hollow image of his homeworld and continued, "You call our storms destruction, but we call them seasons. We build homes that bend with the wind and rise again when the walls fall. You call our predators death, but we call them teachers. They sharpen our eyes, our minds, and our courage. We learn to face them not by hiding, but by standing firm." A student with silver eyes hissed nervously, "Surely no being can fight beasts larger than ships." The cadet turned his calm gaze toward her and answered, "Not always with strength, but with fire, with tools, with unity. Where a beast is stronger, one human cannot win, but many together can overcome. We learn to hunt as packs. We learn to plan traps. We learn to use what the world gave us. Every challenge became a lesson, and every lesson made us stronger." The professor at last found his voice, though it trembled. "Young one, if what you say is true, then how did your kind survive sickness, the invisible killers that cover your world?" The human nodded slowly. "Sickness is part of us. It comes as naturally as air. It tried to end us many times, but we fought back. We made medicine. We learned to heal. We built strength through pain. Our bodies adapt, and when they cannot, our minds create answers. We do not surrender. To what we cannot see, we challenge it until it yields." Whispers filled the chamber. Aliens clutched their robes and wings. Some muttered of madness, others of bravery. A tall reptilian student rose, his claws trembling. "So every day on Earth is a battle. How do you endure a life without rest?" The human's face softened, not with pride but with memory. "We endure because we are not alone," he said. "We endure because we have each other. We built families and tribes, then towns and cities. We learned that unity is our shield and hope is our weapon. Together we are more than prey. Together we become something no storm can erase." His words spread through the chamber like fire. Some students sat in awe, others trembled, but all listened. The image of Earth above them no longer seemed only a picture of chaos. It became something different, a picture of a crucible that shaped beings who refused to bow. The professor leaned heavily on his podium. His eyes burned with questions, but for the first time he was unsure of his own knowledge. He studied the cadet as though staring at a paradox. The student who looked so fragile had just spoken of battles against storms, predators, and sickness as if they were daily chores. He had described survival not as horror but as life, and he stood alive to prove it. The human cadet ended his words not with a shout but with a steady truth. My world is called a death world by your records, but to us it is simply home, and home is not a curse. It is where we learn to fight, to heal, to endure, and to hope. That is how I stand here now. The hall remained silent, no one daring to move. The lesson had turned into something greater than the professor had ever intended, and the native of Earth had claimed the right to teach. The galaxy had just heard the voice of a world they feared, and in that voice was neither despair nor apology, only strength and quiet defiance. Oh, it turns to respect. The stillness in the lecture hall stretched like an unbroken line. Every alien student sat fixed on the human cadet who had just revealed himself. His words hung in the air like sparks from a fire refusing to fade. The professor, who had moments earlier spoken with such certainty, now stood pale and silent. His long fingers, gripping the edge of the podium as though it might anchor him against the tide that had swept the room. At last the professor found his voice, though it no longer carried the unshakable authority it once did. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, but not with anger, with doubt and with curiosity. You speak as though the storms, the beasts, and the sickness are teachers, he said slowly. But how can endless danger shape something more than instinct? How can it create reason, imagination, and invention? The cadet did not hesitate. He lifted his chin and met the professor's gaze. We learned not only to endure, but to think. We asked questions every time we faced danger. We asked, how do we stop this from happening again? How do we make fire to drive away the dark? How do we build walls to hold back the storm? How do we heal the sick? We became more than survivors because we never accepted that survival alone was enough. The students whispered again, but this time the tone was different. It was no longer only fear. Some voices carried wonder. Others carried reluctant admiration. A winged Avrian murmured to her neighbor, "If what he says is true, then their minds were forged, not despite the chaos, but within it." The neighbor nodded, his crest feathers, trembling. Perhaps that is why they endure. The professor pressed further, his tone quiet yet weighted with something close to respect. If your world is as merciless as you say, then surely only the strongest individuals could thrive. How did your kind form unity? How did you not tear each other apart fighting for survival? The cadet's expression softened with memory. Because we had no choice, he said. One human alone cannot fight every storm or predator, but many together can. We learned early that our strength comes not from one but from all. We built bonds that were stronger than fear. We made families, tribes, nations. We fought each other. Yes, but we also came together again and again when the world threatened to end us. And each time we endured, we grew wiser. The alien students listened in silence, now their fear shifting into something else. The sight of this fragile-looking being standing so calm and unbroken in front of them stirred a feeling they had not expected. Their professor had taught them that Earth was a nightmare unworthy of life. But here was life from Earth speaking of unity, resilience, and invention. It was not horror they saw now, but possibility. A young Sarathi student with glittering emerald scales raised her claw, her voice shaking not with fear but with curiosity. Then your people must see the galaxy differently than we do, she said. For us, danger is something to avoid. For you, it seems to be a companion. The human cadet nodded. We do not seek danger, but we know it is always there. We do not flee from it, we prepare for it, and when it comes, we meet it. That is what it means to be human. The hall stirred with awe. The image of Earth above them no longer looked like a cursed world. It looked like a crucible, where fire had shaped something unbreakable. Some students leaned toward the cadet, drawn by the gravity of his words, even as their bodies trembled in instinctive fear. They saw that survival on Earth was not madness, but discipline, not chaos, but strength. The professor stood silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the human. At last he spoke in a tone stripped of mockery or dismissal. "Tell me, cadet, what do you believe your people will bring to the galaxy if they have endured what none of us could?" The human answered without hesitation. "We bring the will to survive when hope seems gone. We bring the proof that even the harshest world cannot stop life from reaching for the stars." The words rolled through the room like a wave, and no one could deny them. The professor bowed his head slightly, not in defeat but in respect. The alien students sat wide-eyed, realizing that the very universe they thought they understood had widened in a single lecture. They no longer looked at the human as fragile. They looked at him as something carved from stone and fire, something to be respected. For the first time in the history of that hall, a death world was not spoken of as a curse but as a teacher, and its native had shown them all that. The impossible was not only possible, it was standing before them. The last lesson. The lecture hall remained quiet long after the cadet had spoken. His words lingered in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to die. The alien students could not move for a moment, as if their bodies had been rooted to the floor. Their eyes followed the human who had taught them more than any lesson in the textbook could convey. He did not boast or demand respect, but commanded it with every gesture and every calm, unshakable word. The professor finally broke the silence, though his voice was softer now, almost reverent. He walked to the podium and leaned against it, his fingers tracing the smooth surface. He had taught Deathworlds for decades, and yet today, he realized how little he had understood. His eyes traveled over the students who were staring at the human, and he could see the change in them. They were no longer just listeners, they were thinkers and dreamers, and a little afraid of their own ignorance. HFY. Human cadet stood tall, his gaze sweeping across the room. He saw curiosity, fear, and awe mingled in every expression. He knew that what he had done was more than survive, more than endure. He had shown them that the impossible could be faced, and the deadly could be overcome. He thought of his home of towering cliffs, storms that tore through forests, and beasts that could kill in a heartbeat. He thought of the countless times humans had banded together and of every invention and strategy that had kept them alive and thriving. He spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "You must understand that a world does not make a species strong. It is what a species does with the world that counts." He stepped closer to the center of the hall and spread his hands as if to encompass every student here. "Every challenge you face in the galaxy will not vanish because you fear it. You must meet it. You must think and act and work with each other, for only together can you overcome what seems impossible." A young Dralith with chitinous armor raised a claw timidly and asked, "If your world is so harsh, how do you keep your people from tearing each other apart?" The cadet smiled faintly. "It is not easy," he said. "There are conflicts and mistakes and moments when it seems everything will fall apart. But we do not give up. We learn from failure, and we forgive, and we plan. And in that way we endure and we improve." Whispers spread through the room as the alien students shared looks and murmurs of understanding. They realized that survival was not only a test of strength, but of mind and heart. Some of them were proud of their own worlds. But now they could see that humans had a skill that was different. The skill to rise again and again to find hope when none existed. The skill to take chaos and make it orderly. Skill to turn pain into creativity and weakness into strength. The professor cleared his throat, and his voice carried a weight that silenced even the whispers. He spoke to both the cadet and the class. "Today you have shown what many of us believed impossible. You have shown that the legends of Deathworlds were only half the story, that the beings who lived there were not just strong in body, but unbreakable in mind and spirit." The human cadet nodded humbly. He looked around one last time, his eyes sweeping the room. He thought of the countless eyes watching him, not with fear, but with respect and a spark of understanding. He knew that this classroom would never be the same again. The alien students would carry the lessons of his world into every corner of the galaxy. They would speak of the humans who had survived storms and beasts and plague and come out stronger and wiser. They would speak of unity, of resilience, of the courage to face the unimaginable. He turned to leave, and the silence followed him like a shadow. The alien students sat frozen in thought, some whispering to one another, some simply staring, and even the professor seemed caught in reflection. They had all been changed by a single human from a death world, and the weight of his lessons pressed on them not as a burden, but as a challenge. As the cadet stepped through the doors of the hall, he felt a strange sense of peace and purpose. The stars outside beckoned him, and the galaxy awaited with dangers and wonders alike. He knew that wherever humans went, they carried with them the fire of their world, the lessons of survival, unity, and courage. He glanced back at the classroom one final time and allowed himself a small smile, knowing that he had planted something that would grow for generations. The door closed and the hall remained silent for a long time. The alien students absorbed the enormity of what they had witnessed. They had expected a lesson about survival, but received a lesson about life, about mind, about spirit. They realized that Earth was not just a legend of peril, but a forge that shaped beings capable of greatness beyond imagination. The professor finally spoke again, and his voice was softer but filled with newfound respect. "You have all learned something today," he said, "and perhaps we will never look at a death world the same way again." The human cadet's footsteps faded in the distance, and yet his presence lingered like a flame that would not be extinguished. A death world had taught them more than they expected, and its native had shown them that humanity was something to be reckoned with, something to be remembered, something to inspire. And in that hall of whispers and awe, the lesson had ended, but its echo would ripple across the galaxy forever. Legacy of the death world. The hall was empty now, but the air still shimmered with the presence of the human who had stood there teaching more than just facts. He had taught courage and resilience and the strange beauty of facing the impossible. The alien students had returned to their seats. Many were quiet, their minds racing, trying to understand how one species could survive and thrive in worlds that would crush others without thought. He walked slowly toward the windows, where the light of distant suns spilled across the polished floor. He paused and looked at the horizon, where planets hung like jewels in the darkness, and felt a surge of pride and humility at the same time. He thought of the wild storms that tore through his home of jagged mountains and boiling seas. He thought of the creatures that could devour a human in a heartbeat, and of the countless ways his people had learned to adapt and survive. He realized that it was not brute strength that had made them endure, but a combination of curiosity and cleverness and stubborn hope. It was the will to rise when others would fall that defined his kind. And it was that will he had shared with the students who had once looked at humans as fragile and perhaps foolish. The professor approached quietly and did not speak for a moment. They both stood looking at the stars, and the professor finally said, "I have taught death worlds for decades, and yet I have never understood the depth of what it means to be from one until today." The human cadet nodded and smiled faintly. He said, "It is not only what the world throws at you, but what you choose to do with every challenge, every storm, every predator, every impossible situation is an opportunity to learn and to grow." The alien students began to stir. They gathered in small groups, whispering excitedly, their voices carrying awe and admiration for the human who had changed their perspective. They debated and laughed and shared their fears and discoveries, and even those who had once doubted began to see a truth that was undeniable. Humanity was not just a survivor species. It was a force of ingenuity and spirit and courage. It had taken the harshest worlds and transformed adversity into advantage. It had faced death and chaos with resolve and creativity, and for the first time many of the alien students felt a strange mixture of inspiration and envy. The cadet turned once more to face the classroom, his expression serious and kind. You must understand that the universe will challenge you in ways that will seem impossible. He raised his hands as if to gather all the worlds in his grasp, but he was only human, and yet in that humanity lay the strength to endure. You will face storms, you will face beasts, you will face dangers that defy imagination. But your mind, your unity, and your determination can turn the impossible into the achievable. The professor watched as the human stepped toward the door and paused. He could see in the students' eyes a reflection of what they had witnessed, a spark that would grow into courage and understanding. He finally whispered something to himself. Humans are not just survivors. He smiled softly, knowing that they were something more. They were teachers of the galaxy in ways that books and simulations could never capture. They were legends, not because they were the strongest, but because they refused to surrender to fear or despair. The cadet left the hall and the doors closed behind him, but his presence lingered like a pulse of light in the minds of all who had watched him. He had shown them that strength was not only in muscle or weaponry, but in spirit and mind and heart. He had shown them that every challenge was a chance to rise, that the harshest Deathworld could forge beings who could inspire a galaxy, and that humanity was a standard that could not be ignored. The alien students stood, and for the first time many of them felt a sense of hope mingled with awe. They knew that they had been given a glimpse of something extraordinary. They understood that the stories of Deathworlds were not merely tales of danger, but of life forged in extremes, and that the human who had lived it was a testament to what was possible when courage and intellect and unity met adversity. And so the hall fell silent again, but this silence was not emptiness. It was full of potential, full of understanding, full of the quiet reverence that comes from witnessing greatness. The lesson had ended, but its impact would echo through generations, through classrooms, through missions across countless worlds. Humanity had spoken, and the galaxy had listened. The end,